The Grand Egyptian Museum is open. What's so special about this billion-dollar mega project? Why does Egypt need yet another museum of antiquities? And what's going to happen to the old institutions that used to serve the tourists? I'm Dominic Perry, a trained Egyptologist, here to explain. After 20 years of construction and a running cost of $1.2 billion US, the Grand Egyptian Museum has finally opened its doors to the public. The gem's history goes back into the early 1990s, when academics, conservators, and government ministers began discussing the need for new museums in Cairo. Since the 1960s and 70s, mass travel had really taken off, and visitors were coming to Egypt in ever-increasing numbers. Problem was, the country's old museums were simply not equipped to deal with that kind of traffic. In particular, the Egyptian Museum, in the heart of downtown Cairo, was really showing its age. Now, this is a lovely building with a venerable history, but it opened in 1902, and its design, display cases, and conservation facilities left a lot to be desired as the 20th century came to its close. The old museum followed the idea of a cabinet of curiosities, a jumble of high-quality art and artifacts across several dozen rooms. Given that it was made in 1902 before electric lighting was widespread, many of the display cases lacked proper labeling and organization, and while the architects had made prodigious use of windows to naturally illuminate the space, this had negative consequences for the artifacts themselves and for travelers. Once cameras became a mass-market commodity, the old Egyptian Museum really started to show its inadequacies. It was really difficult to get a high-quality image of many pieces. So, as mass tourism took off in the 70s and 80s, Egypt's officials began to look to the future and how they would meet the growing burden of their antiquities. Plans developed through the 1990s, and in 2002, the Egyptian government was finally ready to announce the Grand Egyptian Museum project. Officials marked the start of work with a foundation ceremony at the chosen site near Giza. Interestingly, they buried a special stone at the site to formally inaugurate the process. In doing that, they partially replicated a practice that the ancient pharaohs had undertaken. Whenever rulers like Hatshepsut or Ramesses the Great inaugurated a new building project, they would mark the occasion and demarcate the sacred boundary by burying special objects underneath the foundations. Archaeologists have found many of those, and they're on display in the old Egyptian Museum. So it was a fitting beginning for this kind of project. The building work started fairly smoothly, and by 2010, they were ready to open the gem's conservation laboratory. This was a major focus at the start of the project. The old museum simply didn't have the facilities necessary for modern, careful conservation and restoration of artifacts. The new facilities are state-of-the-art. They are large, expansive, and fully equipped for current needs. Even better, this conservation lab gives greater opportunities for Egyptian students to learn the science and craft of preservation, so that they can take a bigger role in the care and management of their own heritage. During the early 20th century, those kind of jobs were dominated by Europeans, and it's been a concerted effort of the Egyptian government over the past few decades to reconnect their people with this part of their history. The new conservation lab and the training programs that go with it mark a really important step in this ongoing project. Unfortunately, after 2010, the gem construction slowed considerably. First, the Arab Spring brought political instability. Then, tourism numbers dwindled drastically, so the government had less tax money and they weren't able to fund construction at the rate they had previously. Finally, the pandemic slowed things down even more. As a result, we've had delay after delay after delay. Every year, it seemed like there was a new announcement that the gem was probably going to open soon. But that got pushed and pushed and pushed. It reached the point that eventually I and many of the colleagues I've spoken to came to the conclusion that the gem is open when it's open. Until that happens, don't get your hopes up. That's not to blame anyone. Those were difficult times in Egypt. And if you've ever worked on a major project, construction or otherwise, you'll know that once the momentum stops, it's really hard to rebuild. But rebuild it they did. And now it's finally arrived. In November 2025, the Grand Egyptian Museum formally opened in full. There was a lavish ceremony, a huge to-do about it. You might have seen it on the news. By that point, small parts of the museum had already opened as a test drive for tourists. First the grand staircase, then some of the main display galleries. But the other sections remained off limits until that final inauguration. Now, every gallery, every display case is ready to go. So, what's new? What's old? And what is so special about the gem? The big headliner is the full display of King Tutankhamun's treasures. Discovered in 1922 and slowly excavated by Howard Carter over the course of 10 years, many of Tutankhamun's items did make their way to the old Egyptian museum. But there, they suffered the same issues: poor lighting, old and dusty display cases, vandalism during the Arab Spring, and the perennial problem, a lack of space from the ever-growing crowds. What's more, the old museum only displayed a tiny portion of Tutankhamun's goods. His tomb contained several thousand items, but if you went to the museum in Tahrir Square, you could see maybe 200. All of the rest were in storage facilities and conservation labs. Apart from special exhibitions, the public never got to see them. Now, things are better. The Grand Egyptian Museum presents the full assemblage of King Tutankhamun's treasures. They are displayed in modern cases with soft artificial lighting so visitors can get excellent photographs, and the items themselves will last better without sunlight damaging them. And beyond that, the best part is really the organization. Previously, Tutankhamun's goods had been displayed in that cabinet of curiosities style, all bundled together with not much labeling or information. Today, they stand in special display cases, organized thematically around different aspects of the tomb. There are cases for daily life items like food and provisions, clothing, the king's chariots, his furniture, the golden shrines, the funerary statues, the magnificent coffins, and, of course, the mask. At the moment, things are pretty crowded. The mask itself is a magnet for people who want to take photos, selfies, and videos of King Tutankhamun's treasures. But forgetting the mask, the rest of the collection is stunning. Definitely worth the price of admission by itself. Beyond Tutankhamun, you also have 12 enormous galleries dedicated to Egypt's ancient past. Again, the organization here really stands out. The 12 rooms are arranged in 3 groups of 4, and you have 2 ways of visiting them. You can stick to a theme and follow that theme chronologically, from the pre-dynastic and Old Kingdom eras all the way to the Greco-Roman times. Or you can choose one era and focus on different aspects of that culture in rooms connected to each other. The collection is vast, with thousands of items, but they're beautifully organized and exceptionally labeled so that you have a good idea of what you're looking at and how it fits together both chronologically and thematically as part of Egyptian history. Along the way, the curators have also highlighted certain masterpiece sections, which are usually illuminated with a special blue light above them, so that you know this one is particularly special. However, there are a lot of items, so I recommend pacing yourself. Don't try to see everything at once. Instead, find the things that you are most interested in and focus on those in particular. You can always come back for more. If you want some tips about the highlights that are worth seeing, or special out-of-the-way objects that are particularly impressive, I'll discuss that in the next episode. Last but not least, there is the Khufu Boat Museum. This is actually a separate building off from the main galleries, where you'll find the beautiful solar barge of King Khufu. We know it's a solar barge because the design of the ship closely replicates that used by the god Ra in funerary texts and art. The ship was discovered in a pit at the Giza Plateau, right next to the Great Pyramid. It had been disassembled in antiquity, but archaeologists were able to identify the individual pieces, how they fit together, and carefully reassemble the ship. For many years, Khufu's boat stood in its own special museum on the southern side of the Great Pyramid. Now, that was a really cool museum and well worth visiting, but it was a little bit of an eyesore, kind of ruining the sightline of the grand monuments. And similar to the old Egyptian museum downtown, it was designed in a different time with different priorities in mind. So as the Grand Egyptian Museum got underway, it was decided that Khufu's boat should be relocated to the new modern facilities. Now, the ship is on display once again, and it is magnificent. But this is not the only Khufu boat. There is another. At the same time they discovered the original ship, archaeologists actually found a second. They decided to leave that one in its pit and simply conserve the pieces rather than rebuilding it. Now though, they've taken the opportunity to slowly reconstruct the second ship in real time in a way that the public can see. A joint team of Egyptian and Japanese conservators have formally begun this process of building the second ship right next to the first. Presumably, the work is going to take at least a couple of years, but visitors to this museum will be able to see the process as it unfolds, and hopefully that will give people an insight into how these ships were made and how archaeological conservators do their work. That's going to be really cool to see over the next few years. So, the gem is, well, a gem of a museum. But what about the others? I often get asked, what is happening to the old museum downtown? Is that going to be decommissioned or shut down, with its treasures moving to the new galleries? Short answer, no. There hasn't been any official announcement, but what I understand through the Egyptological grapevine is as follows. The old museum downtown will continue operating. They're going to use it for temporary exhibitions, especially items that have never been on display. And they still have a vast assemblage of goods that will not be moving to the gem. For better or worse, Egypt almost has too many antiquities to see in one lifetime. The pieces that are staying include things like masterpiece sculptures and art from the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom periods, the funerary goods and treasure troves of figures like Mai-Khepri and of Yuya and Tuya, who are probably the great-grandparents of King Tutankhamun. The museum will also house the silver pharaohs from Tanis. This was a later dynasty of kings who ruled in northeastern Egypt. Their tombs were discovered intact in the early 1940s, and they've been on display at Tahrir ever since. Unfortunately, the silver pharaohs were discovered in the midst of World War II, and they've never quite got the same fame as King Tutankhamun. Which is a damn shame because these are really beautiful pieces, and in some cases they're the equals of Tutankhamun in sheer value. Alas, the public has never given them quite the same recognition. But now is your chance to rectify that injustice. The Old Egyptian Museum at Tahrir Square will continue to operate. And in fact, it's probably going to be better now. As the crowds flock to the Grand Egyptian Museum, there should be less congestion at the Old Museum. And the fact that they're keeping so many masterpieces there means that if you're a genuine enthusiast for ancient Egypt, this is a museum that you simply have to visit. Personally, I highly recommend it. While the gem is spectacular, there is still a certain charm to this old museum. I think it's worth your time. Finally, while we have the gem and the old museum, there is one other essential stop. The National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, or NEMEC, is located in the old suburb of Fustat in eastern Cairo. Here, you'll find an array of items from all of Egyptian history, from earliest antiquity right up to the medieval and early modern periods, which is great if you want to get an idea of how the culture began and developed over the past 5,000 years. There is also a textile museum showcasing the beautiful fabrics for which Egypt has long been famous. And there are mummies. The Grand Egyptian Museum does not have a mummy collection, but if you go to the NEMEC, you can see the royal mummies of dynasties 18, 19, and 20 on display. These were discovered in the late 1800s, and for many years, they were housed in two small rooms at the old museum in Tahrir Square. But it was a pretty cramped space, and it wasn't ideal. Fortunately, in 2021, they were relocated to the NEMEC in the Grand Royal Mummy Parade that you might have seen. Now, the mummies lie in a special underground gallery, along with some of their funerary treasures, like their coffins. Each one gets its own space, its own place to shine, which will give you a better understanding of who these people were and how their bodies were preserved. Unfortunately, there's no photography allowed in this gallery, so I can't show you what it looks like. So, the Grand Egyptian Museum is a wonderful showcase of Egypt's history and antiquities. If you're only visiting Cairo for a day or two, it is absolutely a must-see. If you have a bit more time though, or you're an enthusiast for ancient history, I do recommend visiting the Old Museum in Tahrir Square and the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. You definitely won't regret the effort. Next time, I'll take you in depth on the Grand Museum's collection. With so many items to see, it could be a bit easy to get overwhelmed. I'll show you some of the highlights and also point out some out-of-the-way gems, which are worth hunting down. Thanks for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, comment Life Prosperity Health or Ankh Wedja Seneb, so that I know you're a true enthusiast. Cheers!